the wrong focus,
Yeah.
basically.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, we're live. Okay. You can't control the rates and you can't control inflation, but you can control what data you're using on whether or not you're going to buy a house.
Yeah, so buyers tend to really just focus on some of the wrong things. So today we wanted to talk about what things are important to focus on.
Yeah, I think, right now everyone is obsessing on whether or not rates are going to go down. They're obsessing on whether or not the market is going to crash. They're, obsessing whether or not, we're in a recession or not. And all of that makes home buyers pause because it all makes them uncertain and nervous. But the truth is that none of these things really matter that much in the great scheme of things on whether you're going to buy now or buy later, and you might miss a really good opportunity to buy.
Yeah, markets don't really reward prediction, they reward preparation. So when you're preparing in your mind to purchase a house, you're not looking at, is our interest rates going to drop next month? You're looking at that longer term vision. You're looking at that longer term strategy on making your buying decisions based on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like people that bought houses in 06, 07 that held them till now, they don't regret that. They don't think, oh, if I would have just waited like 5 more years, I could have got a killer deal on this house. I mean, at this point, it doesn't even really matter because their home values are up so much.
Yeah, and I think, trying to control the macroeconomics just isn't going to happen. The Fed can either do rates up or down. Yes, it's important, but really, is it that important when you look at your local or regional level, when you're buying in your community or your area that you're looking to purchase? Does it really matter? Like if you lock in that debt, then you look long term, you're going to come out, ahead at the end of the day.
Yeah, as long as you're planning on holding it, you're going to come out ahead. Like I was with my client and she just bought an $850,000 house. So we're in the neighborhood and I'm waiting for her. So I'm driving around and there's like old cars in the driveways, like Hondas, Toyotas, like not new. And the truth is those people could not afford what their house is worth right now. They could not afford to buy an $800 to $900,000 house. They probably bought those houses when they were like 400,000, right? And I know people don't believe this, but 10 years from now, the people that bought now will not also be able to afford where they're living, because it's going to keep going up. It always does, just because of inflation, if nothing else.
Yeah. And I think that's where you take control of your mindset. You have to have that mindset of, okay, am I going to be here a long time? What does the future look like? And thinking positive on locking in your rates and locking in your debt. So,
Yeah, and it's really is important because I think buyers kind of get in their own way. They want to treat real estate like gambling or like, a stock or, you don't, it's a long-term hold. So like, those people that have owned their homes, like, unless you're selling, it really doesn't matter if it's going down. It's eventually going to go up.
yeah. And when it's your primary residence, like you have to pay for a place to live no matter what. So does it really matter if, your property, let's just say it appreciates, $10,000 and then it drops, $20,000. Like it's going to fluctuate a little bit depending upon what the economy is doing. But at the end of the day, you have your fixed rate, you have your payment, you have, a place to live. And that's the most important thing.
Well, and even if you're an investor, like I bought a place in 2022, it's down 20 grand, okay? But I've collected over $70,000 in rent payments. So like, do I care that it's down 20 grand? I mean, in the long scheme of things, like if I would have waited and bought now and saved 20 grand, I also would have missed out on, 70 some thousand dollars in rent.
Exactly. I have a triplex that's the same thing. If I would have waited till interest rates came down, that purchase price, if I wanted to buy it at that time, would have been way higher. So really, payment wise, it would probably have washed out, but I wouldn't have had that asset for as long as I did to start building equity sooner. So really it is, time in the market is a lot more important than timing the market and controlling what we can control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, let's look at what we can control because people like to focus and stress about what you cannot control instead of trying to focus on what you can. So, one of the things that you can control is what kind of debt that you get on a property that you buy.
Yeah, so I know some people like the long-term fixed rate, which if it's your primary residence, you can definitely control your interest rate for 30 years. But maybe you're looking at something like a 15 or 20-year loan. You can control that piece. So focus on that and do your cash flows based on that.
You can. And I do think, though, that you should fix it. Like, I think in this kind of environment, even though I believe rates are coming down next year, I wouldn't bet a whole entire loan on that. I would get fixed rate debt that cash flows now if you're an investor, and or fixed rate debt that you can afford now if you're a home buyer. And, don't try to do one of these, it's adjustable in 5 years or whatever, because you don't know what that rate's going to be then. And to me, because it's a long-term play, that is risky.
Well, and some people say, well, refinancing costs money. I just want to wait till the rates go down. What do you tell them?
Well, he has to math out, right? Depends on the math, like I've talked to my lender, which I think everyone should do, to figure out, I have a loan that's at 6.9 and I want to know when it financially makes sense. Like at what rate does it financially make sense to refinance that loan? Because there are times when it can be a waste of money and there, are times where it's not, and you have to know that breaking point.
Yeah. So sometimes it might be, a 1-year payback or a 3-year payback, which if you have your lender, they can help you estimate that holding period. And if you're thinking of selling or you're certain that you're going to sell before that, even though it's a lower interest rate, it might not work or make sense to refinance. So
yeah, because it does cost money, and also your payments kind of reset. So, at the beginning of a loan, you always pay the most interest on the payment. So you have to calculate that in as well.
Yeah. So it is interesting to look at those numbers and go everything accordingly. And another thing that you can control is your negotiations. So if you're a buyer or an investor looking to buy a property, you can always negotiate the terms and you can control the terms that you propose to a seller.
Yeah, and especially if you're an investor, you should know the price you need for it to cash flow. And that should be your base bottom line, no questions asked. And then you find a seller that's willing to make that happen, right? Like a seller that's willing to sell for the cash flow price. And you'll find them. I just had one last week. Like, they're hard to find right now, but there are sellers that are motivated and you can find them. But what you don't want to do is just pay more than cash flows if it's an investment property, or pay more than you can afford if it's your house.
Yeah, exactly. And operational efficiencies are another thing that you can control. So if you're, switching from, fuel oil heat source to natural gas or electric, there's things that maybe would be a small input cost, but it would drastically change your holding costs on a property.
Yeah. And then also, for me, like I've had my tenants start to pay for things that I didn't used to have them pay for, like pest control. I add $25 a month to their rent in pest control. And so then we have, so there's things that you can do to help your budget. The one thing that I'm having trouble with is the HOA cost. Those are definitely, are we okay, Jerry? Yeah. Okay. The HOA costs, because those are something that are out of your control.
Yeah.
So that's been hard, because just because you're budgeting correctly does not mean your HOA board is.
Right. So knowing what those HOA boards are budgeting or the projects that are coming up, because if you walk through a community that has an HOA, is everything being upkept, or are they trying to cut costs and save pennies? And then, then you're going to get hit with something big down the road. So really knowing the financial viability of that is important.
Yeah, and you always need to check the HOA financials, especially right now. Like, people are getting hit with $10,000 assessments. In Scottsdale, there's an HOA that's going bankrupt, which when that happens, it's all cash sales and it's a nightmare to be a owner in a community like that. So you really need to understand what's going on with your HOA if you're in one. Like, if you've gotten a big assessment, like a $10,000 assessment, I would want to know what's going on with my HOA, because maybe it's time to sell and get out of it, before it hits rock bottom. And then if you're buying, making sure you're not entering into that kind of situation. Now, sometimes they can get a $10,000 assessment and it's fine because they're putting in a new pool or they're doing something. But if it's just because they're low on funds, then that is not a good sign, especially if they've had kind of multiple of those throughout the years. Yeah. And so anyways, it was funny because, when you ask an HOA to look at their budget or modify their budget, they never want to do that. They always want to give you the violations, but when it comes to asking questions about their budget, they just don't want to answer. And they pick the funniest things to cut too.
Yeah, which is interesting to watch some of the dynamics on an HOA board. But
well, one of mine, so I started to get cockroaches in one of my units, and I called the HOA because they spray, and they let me know that they cut pest control.
Oh.
And I'm like,
nice to know.
Oh, okay. They go, we can send somebody out like upon request, but like we're not doing it monthly. Well, if you know anything about an apartment building, is if you don't spray all the units, they're going to have cockroaches, right? So now I have my unit, I just hired it out every 3 months. I'm getting it sprayed because that's the only way to keep them out because, neighbors are going to have that. I mean, food attracts cockroaches, and you're always going to have people in an apartment that are, somebody is not going to be taking care of their unit, and you're sharing walls.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's things that we don't really think about in our market a ton, but it's interesting to hear what other markets are seeing or how things work like that. So
I was shocked they cut pest control. I don't think that's normal, nor do I think it's a good idea, but I'm like, it is it's what they decided was no longer a priority. And we have the landscape guys out every week, but not the pest control people.
Yeah, no, for sure. One of the other things that you can control, and I think that this is so important, your emotional response. So like if you're really beat up about, not winning an offer, don't get wrapped up in the emotions of, like when you're at an auction and you keep bidding higher and higher and higher because you just want to win. That's not always in your best interest if somebody's just paying a crazy number to live next to somebody. You never know what somebody else's motivations are when you're in a bidding war against somebody, but you don't want to let your emotions get the best of you. You want to look at everything objectively with the current data. And if it doesn't work at that point, then you need to walk away.
And I've even have clients stop looking. Like they lose out on a deal and they get frustrated and they feel like they can't compete in this market and they're done. And it's like, don't do that, because I'm telling you, like the deals are out there. You just have to find whenever you're putting an offer on a house, like I try to tell my clients, and I know this is really hard, but don't get excited about it until the offer's accepted, and don't get really excited about it until you're through the 10-day inspection, right? And so like keep your emotions in check. Don't start thinking, okay, so I'm going to put my bed here and I'm going to, I hope I get it. I'm not going to think about it. We're going to see what happens, because when you get really wrapped up in it, there's always going to be another deal. Like I promise you, it might be a while, but there will always be another deal. So don't get so invested that you just get, upset. Like my stepson just bought a house and it had flooded, right? And they took our offer and we're in escrow, but we got a full mold test on the house because the whole house had flooded. And I kept telling him, you cannot get excited until we get this mold test back. Like you cannot, like no matter what, because we don't know. And luckily it came back. It was fine. Now you can be excited. Now you can plan your moving date when you can let everyone know. You can let your apartment complex know, but don't do anything until you get through that, because it really is, people just get so worked up and then they get so let down.
Yeah. And it just reminds me, I closed a house earlier this week and the client was nervous. He was a client that called me probably more than average, which isn't a bad thing. Like always call, but he was always, I'm nervous. I'm just really nervous. And when we went to do the final walkthrough, he finally is like, okay, I'm not nervous anymore. I'm excited. Like we were going to sign papers in like an hour to make everything finalized. And at that point he got excited. So it was fun to see that and work through that.
It is fun. And the other thing is like, so I took an investor client out to look at houses, and we looked at them and she had one that was her favorite. But you always have to work back when it's an investment to like what makes the most financial sense to. Like you have to like the property if it's going to be an investment property. Like you can't like dislike it, but you also have to look at the numbers. And luckily the one that she ended up liking was the one with the best numbers. But I kept telling her, okay, I know you really love this one, but you like these other two as well. And when we get home, we have to pull average rents. We have to pull, mortgage payment. We have to pull HOA, because it's got to make sense, And I think people too get wrapped up in the emotion of like, it's almost like they're buying it to live in it. And you're like, no, this is an investment. So like, it literally is all about the numbers. And yes, you can't hate the property.
Yeah, right. Oh, for sure. And it's like, if they cash flow when she was looking at them, then great. If she were to refinance after, then it would make the cash flow even better, if all things are equal. So it's good that you reminded her to look at the numbers of them. Even if you have a feeling on a property, if you're an investor, you can't always go off of that.
No, because sometimes, you might love a house, but the rents just aren't there, or the HOA is too high, or, whatever, right? And you just really have to be
Yeah.
honest with the rent you can get, and then the mortgage, and then any other expenses, right? And then, like I said, you do
Yeah.
have to like it, though. Like, I had this client, we were looking, and there was a sink in the master bedroom, and she could not get over there was like this sink, and it was funky, you know what I mean? But like on something like that, like, she really hated the property because of it. And I'm like, well, I don't think you should buy something you hate. Like if you're going to hate it, that's going to come off and come across, when you're showing it and everything else. So don't buy a property
Yeah.
you hate, but like you really do have to look at the numbers when you're deciding on like what you're going to buy.
Yeah. If you go off feeling, you could be walking through the nicest home in the crappiest neighborhood, and that's the one thing you can't change.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you like the house, you can't pick up a house and move it anywhere. So you have to look holistically at the big picture and then make decisions.
Exactly. And let's look at like applying some of this discipline, to the real estate market. Like we talked about if it cash flows and that's important. And I think that we've like hit that one home. Like it has to cash flow at today's rates. It cannot cash flow on what you think rates are going to be next year.
Yep, absolutely. And if you can do a value add, if it cash flows barely, but it needs, a door and something to add another bedroom, like with very minimal input, you can increase that, then okay, look at it. But it really does have to cash flow when you purchase it, like day one.
Day one. And don't be afraid to ask these sellers for money off. Like on the house that we just bought, the bathtub was one of those walk-in bathtubs because it was an older person that owned the home. And that's not going to be great for a renter. And so we asked for $5,000 off for the bathtub and we got it, so kind of try to calculate in your offer, any improvements you want to do because you might be surprised and they might actually give you those off in this kind of market.
Well, and you bring up a good point. You didn't just blindly ask for $5,000 off the price. You said, hey, this bathtub is a concern. It doesn't really work for our use, and you used a specific example with a specific amount versus, oh, let's just ask for 5% closing costs or whatever it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
It is a mental thing for sellers, especially when they're going to negotiate. It's important.
It is. And they know it's an issue. Like they know going in that bathtub's an issue because they know most people, unless it's an older person, are not going to want that. And so they're kind of ready for that. And it said on the listing, sold as is, So really there was no real wiggle room for that kind of stuff, but you can still ask. But I prefer to ask in the offer than in the inspection because if you're going to offer in it depends. If you're taking it either way, then you can ask after the inspection. But if it's a deal breaker for you, then you better ask in the offer because if not, you're wasting a bunch of money on the inspection.
Yeah. And your time, both.
Yeah, both, right? And our time too.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I do want to talk about finance strategy because I think that there are ways like seller financing and there's different ways to try to get a lower rate than like through a traditional lending situation. Now, do you do a lot of that? I don't do a lot of that.
Yeah, actually, I do from time to time. It's not every deal, but on occasion, we'll do a contract for deed, on a full amount of a full house. But the seller carryback is something that I've seen a little bit more common because then that seller can, they get a lump sum at the beginning. Like, let's just say they get paid for 80% of the property. And then that 20%, they take a second position to the bank and then they can take that income over, the next couple of years or whatever terms are set up with that buyer. So it helps the buyer secure bank financing if they don't have quite enough for a down payment. Then that seller essentially is underwriting that buyer and taking that risk. Like they're paid for 80%. They're going to essentially gamble on being second position for that 20%. But if they believe in the client, they can pull their own credit report or do whatever they want to do. But then they would take a note in second position. So sometimes we do see that. We've done a couple of assumable loans, although those can be a little bit more tricky because as properties have appreciated so much, if somebody got an assumable loan, 3 years ago, it's only for the balance that's left. Well, if a property went from, let's just say $200,000 and now it's worth 300, then where do they come up with the difference? So they either have to bring the cash difference to closing or get a secondary loan. Well, not everybody wants to take a second position to a bank for that much money. So
Right.
on paper, they're good. Have I seen some? Yes, but they're not, the assumable loans aren't as common as like a seller carryback.
Well, I know Pace Morby does like the sub 2 loans, I know like where you just take them over and you make the payments even though you don't transfer it from the bank. And
Yep.
I've seen a little bit of that in Phoenix. I've definitely seen some of that. It's a good opportunity. If you can convince someone to do it, like it can be a good opportunity for you as a buyer. It's not easy to convince people to do it because they're skeptical of it, but my only advice is if you do it, I'm not against it at all. I think it's great. If you do it, make sure you get it lawyered up, papered up. I had a friend that did it up in Seattle, but he kind of did it wrong because he was cheap and he didn't really get it papered up and the house flooded. So then the insurance was still had to be claimed under the owner of the home, not him, but the original owner of the home. And it was kind of this whole disaster because, the insurance company couldn't know about the sub 2 or they wouldn't have paid. And it was just this whole thing. So just make sure if you do it right. And if you're a seller that's going to let somebody sub 2 your place, make sure they have experience and you get legal opinions and you do it right, because the risk is more on the seller than the buyer. And you just need to have all your legal, I's dotted and T's crossed.
Yeah. And that's brings up a really good point. And the other thing on the financing strategy is some sellers don't realize how much of a tax savings they can realize if they do decide to sell on a contract for deed, even if it's a short term, like, 3-year contract or 50% upfront and carry 50%. Sometimes asking the question, hey, have you considered this as a tax play? Sometimes they'll say, well, no, I haven't, versus, hey, will you sell contract for deed or will you owner finance? Usually the rubber stamp of no is coming until you say, like, well, why is it a benefit for them? Like, why or how can it be mutually beneficial? And then you have some really productive conversations.
And that's what you have to do. You have to make it, if you're just selling it for yourself as the buyer, no seller is going to do it. But if you can make it beneficial, like I have a friend, he's getting a divorce, but it's not finalized. So he can't buy anything yet, but he really wants this house. So I said, why don't you ask them if you can do rent to own? And then, make it for 3 years because your divorce will be done. And then you'll get, will actually have the cash. So then you have the cash to pay it. Right. And so he's like, you think they would do that? I go, I think you should let them know that one, if you decide not to do it, the contract will be written up so they just can keep all the payments. Right. And then for 2 is that it saves them a lot of tax, because these payments are going to be divided before that big lump sum payment. And he brought it up to them and they're considering it. They haven't given him a yes or a no, but they didn't say, no, not doing it. They're having their attorney look at it. You really have to educate people. And if you have a good attorney that can talk to the seller, because if they just call some random attorney that's never heard of this, that's probably not going to be a great conversation either. So anything you can do to show them that it's beneficial and give them resources of people to talk to so they can trust that it's beneficial for them, it can really save them and you a lot of money. And that's, in this environment, a great way to get a 5% rate or a lower rate versus just waiting for rates to drop.
Yeah, I think that it's so many good points. And when you sit on the sidelines versus waiting for rates to drop, then what are you going to give up?
Right. Well, if you wait for rates to drop, so is everybody else. So nobody was going to do seller financing, 3 years ago, right? Because you could list your house and sell it in 10 days. Why in the world would you want to do seller financing? Really? I mean, yes, it's a benefit, but on the tax, but you also could just price your house for what you want and sell it, right? So now that there's tension in the market, sellers are considering seller financing because they want to sell it for a certain price. They want to get out of their house. It's not as easy to sell as it was a few years ago. So now is when you have that leverage. So if you decide, I'm just going to wait till rates drop, well, guess what? So is everybody else. So now you're going to have more competition. You're going to have sellers that aren't conceding like they were. I mean, I'm even seeing like sellers were offering way more concessions back in April. Like I just had a buyer that she wanted me to see what things had sold for in her neighborhood. And I pulled up the last 3 months, and one house had a 1% concession and the other 7 had no concession that sold in the last 3 months. In Phoenix, in April and over the summer, almost every house had 3% concessions. I mean, so, so that's how it's changing. And that's a lot of money. That's $20,000 difference right there, not looking at anything else. So, I mean, things are changing. So you don't want to just keep waiting until rates are down, because guess what? Prices go up.
Well, exactly. And when you talk to a seller, this, kind of reminds me when I bought one of mine, seller financing, I said, hey, I'm pre-approved with the bank. Here's my pre-approval letter, or I can do these terms, seller financing, and I gave them the option, and they're like, well, let me talk to my tax person. I hadn't really thought about that. I ended up putting less money down with the seller finance, and they ended up putting more in their pocket, and I negotiated a slightly lower monthly payment because I wasn't paying some of the bank fees and origination fees and such. So we both ended up with a better win-win, and then that seller, because it was a multifamily unit, they're used to getting like mailbox money via rent. Well, now they're just getting mailbox money via, a property purchase. So they're used to that, but it was something that had never crossed their mind. And the bigger thing, besides the mailbox money, was at the time, because this was a couple of years ago, the returns in the stock market were like up and down, and it was, do you put in now or do you not? Where they were like, well, we'll finance you at 6%. And at the time, banks were like at 7.5%. So I said, perfect. Like I'm saving 1.5 points. They have that sure money versus putting something in like, a CD or something that a savings account that pays you like 1%. They were for sure at 6%. So that was like their guaranteed money. So it was really worth it for them based upon looking at the big picture of everything going on in the finance world and the real estate world. They were happy, and I was happy.
How many years did you do with them?
We did 5 years with options to renew. They're older, but I think I'll be talking with them next year again to see if they want to re-up it, and I think that they do. So this is kind of funny, I send 12 checks at a time. I write out my handwritten checks, and I write 12 of them out, and I send them to them in a Christmas card. So I'm like, Merry Christmas, here's your rent checks for next year. And they have them all dated. And he always calls and leaves me a voicemail and says, thanks for the Christmas present. So
that's hysterical.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing though, is, some people might try to do that once, and then when they hear a no, they're done. Like, this isn't a thing. Or maybe they try 3 times. These kind of deals, like you literally have to like try until you get the right situation where it works.
Yep.
And that is your reward. It's kind of like they call it the sweat equity, right? I mean, you're putting in the work. If you just want to make it easy, then just go to a bank, do the traditional, wait for a deal to cash flow, wait for rates to go down to 5% if you want. Like if you want to make it easy. If you want to, really put the work in, you can really get good deals in this market.
Yeah, and if you say no, you're one no closer to a yes. You're not out anything. I mean, you can still decide to buy the deal with traditional financing. You don't have to not do it because the seller said no.
Exactly.
Nice to have options.
Options are great. And so also like you need to focus on the data in your area. So that's the biggest thing. It's like stop watching the news, stop watching all the different YouTube crash bros. Like look at the actual data in your area. Like go on Zillow, mark houses in your vicinity that you want to buy that are in your price point and heart them, and then watch and see how fast till there's offers on them and what they close for. Like actually do some data. Like you can't just like, I feel like everyone's like not everybody I talk to, but a lot of people are like, well, I'm waiting for the market to crash. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. What indications do you have that the market's crashing? Because I took a buyer to go look at 7 houses last week. She liked 3. She wanted to wait a week to think about it, and all 3 were under contract. So I don't know what world that's a crash, but apparently, a lot, those kind of videos get a lot of clicks. They get a lot of views.
Yeah.
And I just think, and I think everywhere in the whole country is different. I think there are some places where prices are going down more than other places. So that's why you need to get really specific. And instead of watching YouTube videos on the Scottsdale real estate market or whatever, you need to go and find houses for yourself and follow the data for yourself.
Yeah, and I think you can look at lots of different things. There's regional job reports or even the news. Like if you get a local newspaper, depending on where you live, it's gonna say, oh, so and so's adding 10 jobs, or this place laid off 20. Like whatever that is really good information. The other thing I found really helpful that would definitely work in some of the smaller markets is get to know your local county assessors. Our assessor does an awesome report of all of the multifamily sales within the county, and they break it out per unit price, per square foot price. They note anything like if it was a related party or not, the terms, if it was a contract for deed versus, an arm's length transaction. They note all of those things. So within a snapshot of, taking 15 minutes to read this report, it makes it so easy to really recognize if that's a good deal or not, because you have the data that supports it and it's recent and it's just great. So that's kind of a fun fact in smaller markets for sure.
That's a great tip. Yeah, I don't know how that would work in like a bigger market, but in a smaller market, I'm sure that that's great because you get more pinpointed data points than, and sometimes in a bigger market.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think the biggest thing is, when times feel uncertain is when people build the most wealth. And people want to make moves when they feel certain, but that's like the worst time to make a move because, like in 2020, right? That was super uncertain. Well, prices were low, and then all the investors jumped in and all the people that understood what was happening jumped in. And then in 2022, everyone felt really comfortable buying a house, but now home prices are really elevated, right? Or, it's the same thing when people were buying in 2010, everyone would have told them that they were crazy. We just got off the backs of the Great Recession, and now they all look like geniuses because they were buying houses in Phoenix that are like $600,000 for like $200,000, right? If that. Yeah. So, you don't want to wait until everyone is doing it. You want to, with the correct data, you want to do it when times feel uncertain.
Yeah, and I think, you kind of balance this no risk, no reward with doing your homework. And if both of them sort of cross, then, move confidently. And, I sold the house in 2020. I wish I would have kept it because I would have looked like a genius. But, when you take everything into consideration, you can control what you can and move forward.
Yeah, and you just don't look at like after you buy a house, like honestly, stop looking at what it's worth. Like unless you're gonna sell it. Like if you're looking to sell it, then you have. But like, who cares? Like, okay, I bought this rental property for $500,000. Now it's worth $470,000. Like, okay, like you know what I mean? Like, who cares? You bought your house that you're gonna live in for 10 years. Are you really jumping on? I mean, I know Zillow's made it so quote unquote easy, even though they're not always right to like see your Zestimate or whatever. But those change all the time. Like I have, you know what I mean? Like some days you're down 20 grand, then you're up 10 grand. Like who cares, right? Like it doesn't matter. Like stop, get out of your head that this is a short-term play. Get out of your head that you need to buy this and it can only go up. And that is the only way you made a good decision if it goes up from the time you bought it until the time you sell it. Like that's silly. Like you have to look if you're an investor at the numbers, and you have to look if you're a homeowner at the money you're paying in rent that you could be putting towards a house.
Well, exactly. And then inflation catches up, so is the government printing more money or less? It's like they keep on printing. So essentially that sort of inflates your debt away. So not saying to go out and make a dumb decision just because the government's printing more money, but I mean, it definitely is a factor where if something makes sense, does it fluctuate a little bit? Yes, certainly, of course. It has to work from day one, but inflation is a fact. It's a factor in a fact. So
it totally is. And you know what's funny is, so we have some friends in Canada and we were chatting with them last week, and their average home price in Canada is $750,000 average. So that's not like high. That's like their average in all of Canada, including, in the big cities, it's in the millions, right? It's like 1.2. So they asked like, how much is a starter home in Phoenix? And I said, you can get a starter home in Phoenix for like $550,000, which I feel like it's a lot. They were blown away. They
Yeah.
couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe for $550,000 you could get a starter home in a big city. You know what I mean? Like a big populous city. And for us, we're like, that's ridiculous, you know? And so when people think that prices can't go up anymore, I mean, look at Canada. Because right now, our average home price, I think, is $450,000. So they're like 30% ahead of us. So if you think that home prices can't go up, they certainly can. And Canada does not have fixed rate debt. They have fixed rate debt every 5 years, and they call it a fixed rate 30-year loan, but it's not. It resets. Like, say you're, 1 point over the bank lending number, right? Then you stay 1 point over. But if the bank lending number goes up, like, you go up too. Like, it's not really, they consider it fixed, but it's not really fixed.
It's amortized over 30 years, but I've had several conversations when we go to on vacation in Mexico. Lots of Canadians down there, and we talk about the housing market, and they say, the same thing, that their homes are, like you said, 750, 800,000 for a starter home or more, but their wages really aren't that different either. As far as like an average annual salary, like comparatively speaking, maybe a little bit higher, but not that much higher to be that different. And then when it resets your debt transactions, there's a lot more transactions because people's financial status might change, or it's just very crazy. We're lucky in the United States to still have access to 30-year fixed debt, which is, as far as I know, or as far as I've read, very, very rare for the rest of the world.
It's a bad deal for the banks, to be honest, which is why they're government funded, right? Because if they weren't government backed, then they wouldn't do this. Because, you're setting a interest rate now, and you're going to honor that interest rate for 30 years. So it's not, and if it goes down, I can just refinance. So it's not like a win-win where it's like, oh, she got in at 7 and now we're at 5, so we're winning. It's like, no, I'll just refinance and then I'll do, so it's like all risk to the bank and no reward in that regard. And so we're like one of the only countries that allows you to do that. So, and we might not even forever. If we keep seeing the inflation like we've seen it, then I don't even, or if the banks, completely privatize, it's not a good deal for them. Honestly, it's not. And so what would make more sense is what Canada does, which like every 5 years it resets. That way we're all on the same page. The bank's still making money, but that's bad for the consumer, right? And so, you have to look at that. Like, you have to look at all those things. Like, U.S. real estate is such a good investment.
Yeah. And I've heard some scuttle about potentially a 40-year amortization on mortgages, which is just mind-blowing as well.
If that happens, guys, home prices are going up, because I can promise you that 80% of clients solve to their monthly payment. So if their monthly payment they'll be like this sweet spot where if you want to jump in with a 40-year, like, awesome. But then, prices go up because people will say, well, I can afford $1,500 a month, and that means I can get another, $30,000 in house, and say, and so you're going to have that happen over time eventually. But I think they're going to do it because they're not really talking right now about first-time home buyer or anything, but they are talking about this 40-year mortgage, and that is going to make it more affordable for people.
Yeah, I wonder how that'll all transpire in the coming years, but it'll be definitely something to watch.
Well, people are like, aren't you basically a lifelong renter at that point? If you have a 40-year mortgage and you're, 30 when you buy your house, or, 35. But at the end of the day, though, is you do build equity in your home. So the home is going to appreciate in value, and all your payments do go towards your mortgage. So like, that's much better than being a lifelong tenant where all your rent payments just go to the wind and you never see anything back from them, and you don't own the home and nothing appreciates when you go to sell it.
Yeah. And I think, when things are uncertain, like this is an uncertainty coming up, if they will implement this or not, but in every cycle, biggest wealth transfers happen when things feel uncertain. So if you're feeling that uncertainty, pay attention to what experienced investors, experienced buyers, or real estate professionals are doing, and follow their lead.
Yeah. And if you guys have questions on, real estate in any of these markets, we're going to put our contact information below, and just feel free to reach out.
Yeah. Happy to talk about it.
All right. You guys have a good one.
Bye.